Thank you so much, Bob, for that great message and song and great reminder. And thank you all for the praise and worship this morning as well. Great songs of praise and great time of worship. Thank you all so much. We're going to dismiss children's worship at this time. It's for grades K through 5. So we'll let Barry and Angie go ahead and be dismissed. They are meeting currently in our youth room. And we'll go ahead and dismiss children in the overflow room for children's worship, and then any that are in the worship room. Hope all of you have a great time together this morning. It is great to be together today, and thank you for joining us if you're a guest. We love having guests join us on the Lord's Day, and so thank you so much for being here. Hope you've been refreshed by your time with us, and hope that will continue this morning as well. Move into the study this morning. I think we're all well aware that one of the certainties of life is that in life we will face disappointment. I think we're well aware of that. Disappointment in life is a certainty because we live in a frail, broken world that's been affected by sin. And so that will naturally lead to us sometimes facing disappointment. And then we have our own frailty, our human frailty, the frailty of other people around us. That will naturally lead to disappointment. Disappointment is something that we can't escape. It's a reality, it's a certainty in life because of the reasons that I just mentioned. Some will experience more, others will experience less, but it's something that none of us can escape. And it comes in many different avenues. I think we're also well aware of that. Probably the first thing that comes to our mind would be relationships. That would probably be at the top of the list. You know, sometimes people hurt us. Sometimes people let us down. And by the way, we're guilty as well in our human frailty. Sometimes we're the ones contributing to that. So in relationships, disappointment can come in our work and our careers. I mean, things might be going well, and then all of a sudden that changes, and things aren't going so well. Maybe disappointment will come through financial hardship. You know, some financial setback, a loss of income. Our retirement account takes a hit. You know, maybe something physically will bring disappointment into our lives. You know, out of nowhere will come an injury or an illness that we weren't expecting. Many other different avenues where we might face disappointment. I think about this past year, all that folks have faced with this pandemic, and I especially think about young people in school and some of the disappointment that they've had to face in regard to normal activities and opportunities in life being sidelined. I would think that was a real disappointment, especially for those in the high school category. We'll also face disappointment spiritually. You know, disappointment with ourselves because of some failure or because of our lack of growth as a believer or something perhaps that God has allowed to come our way that we're disappointed with. And it is important for us to respond properly to disappointment because it's a certainty. And if we don't learn to respond to disappointment properly, that can cause greater problems. You know, it can lead to spiritual defeat. And in fact, it can go even further. It can lead to spiritual retreat. We can really begin to go backwards in our relationship with the Lord if we don't respond to disappointment properly. And if we don't, and we continue in a state of allowing that disappointment to control us, that ultimately may lead to some really poor decisions in life. So I think it's very important, since disappointment is a reality, it's a certainty, we're going to face it. It is important that we learn to respond to it properly. What a model we have in the Scripture of a young man by the name of Joseph. A young man who faced an awful lot of disappointment in his young life. But as we have seen so far, he has had an amazing response to all that has come his way. the disappointing circumstances, the hard circumstances. And we're going to continue seeing that today. We're going to see him facing even more disappointment. You would think that by now he's had enough. But we're going to see him facing more today, and we're going to see, once again, an amazing response. And what a great example he is. What a great example he is to us in regard to how we should learn to respond to the disappointment and the hardship and the difficulties that come our way. So I trust this morning that we'll be ready to learn and to grow from his example. The example that we're going to look at this morning can be found in Genesis chapter 40. Thank you for finding your way there. We will have the scriptures on the screen as always as we continue our series this morning, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Another great lesson or lessons from his life. Chapter 40, we're going to cover the entire chapter this morning, so we have a lot of ground to cover, so we better move forward. Let's do that, shall we? First, though, we need to quickly review the context and understand the disappointment that Joseph has already faced. Perhaps we need that reminder this morning. He was hated by his own family, his brothers, who conspired to kill him, only to change their mind and to sell him into slavery instead. And with that, he was taken to Egypt, where he was once again sold as a slave in the house of Potiphar. But as we saw when that first happened, we saw Joseph being successful in that situation. We saw him making the most of his circumstances. We saw him advancing, even as a slave, making the best of his unwanted, difficult, and disappointing circumstances. But following that success came more disappointment. He was imprisoned, not because he had done something wrong, but because of the lies of Potiphar's wife. And so that's a lot of disappointment so far. Let's remind ourselves of his response so far. Number one, we've seen him practicing the presence of God. God was with him, and we saw Joseph, and we've seen him practicing God's presence. We've seen him allow God to grow him and to grow his character in those circumstances. We've seen him allowing God to advance him in his life. Not just settling for disappointment, but making the most of his hard and difficult and disappointing circumstances. So his current circumstances, as we move into our study this morning, again, aren't good. They're hard, they're difficult, they're disappointing. He is in a dungeon, imprisoned in one of Pharaoh's prisons. He's not doing soft time, he's doing hard time. In Psalm 105, we're told that he suffered greatly physically in that imprisonment. And yet we saw in our previous study, as he was placed into that dungeon, that God was with him. And again, we saw Joseph practicing the presence of God. And as a result of that, God gave him favor with the prison keeper. Again, making the most of his situation. And in having that favor with the prison keeper, he began to have the responsibility to oversee the other prisoners. That everything all the other prisoners were doing were at the direction of Joseph. Again, I would call that making the most of a situation. He could have sat down and cried and given up, but he made the most of his situation. Advancing even as a prisoner. He's handling disappointment well. And this morning we're going to see that once again. His circumstances remain difficult. I don't want to overuse the word disappointing. I've probably already done that, but I want you to get the picture this morning. This is disappointing. And yet we're going to see him live in victory. But then at the end of the passage of Scripture, we're going to see him face even more disappointment. And yet we'll see him handle that well. In fact, that disappointment that we'll see at the end of our session this morning will lead to, in our next session, seeing his exaltation. And that's how it works in the sovereign plan of God. So let's look at this morning Joseph's difficulty, his disappointment. He's imprisoned. Again, not because he did anything wrong. He had great character. He was serving God. But because of the lies of Potiphar's wife. And so in his imprisonment, we're told in verse 1, it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. So some time has passed. We don't know how much time. I would say likely a significant amount of time that he has been there in this dungeon, in this prison. How can we conclude that? Well, let's remember he was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery, taken to Egypt, sold as a slave in Potiphar's house. And we know for certain later in the Genesis narrative that he would be 30 years old before he was released from this imprisonment. And in fact, we know at the end of this passage that it would be another 2 years before he would be released. So he was, in the ballpark of 28 years old. So he was probably in this imprisoned situation for a significant period of time. So now he's joined by the butler and the baker. They did something to offend the Pharaoh. That's not a good thing to do. They did something to make the Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth at this point in human history, angry, as verse 2 will tell us. It's likely because of their position, and I'll explain that in just a moment, that they were suspected of attempting to take the king's life by poisoning him. These were important officials of Pharaoh. The butler was the king's cupbearer, the one who brought Pharaoh his drinks. And in that position, he would have had the ear of Pharaoh as well. The baker was his chief confectioner, the one who baked his breads and his other baked goods. Both of these were expected to be trusted officials beyond the influence of the king's enemies, but yet they were suspected of a serious offense and imprisoned. We see the result of that, the reality of that in verses 2 and 3. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, in the place where Joseph was confined. So they're put into prison with Joseph. Again, we're talking about Pharaoh's prison, chapter 39, a prison that was attached to the house of the captain of the guard, the commander of the prison. And specifically, we're told in chapter 41 that he was in the dungeon, in a dark and hard and difficult place. So they're placed there with Joseph. Verse 4 then tells us, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. That's interesting, the captain of the guard, the commander of the prison. This isn't the prison keeper that we talked about in chapter 39. We're talking about the commander of the prison. We're talking about someone who had the same position as Potiphar. So therefore, the prison was attached to their house. Now, I don't think this was Potiphar. There must have been multiple, prisons like this where there was a commander of the prison. With the prevalence of Potiphar's name in chapter 39, I think we would have been told if this was in fact Potiphar. So the captain of the guard gave Joseph responsibility for the butler and the baker. I mean, he must have received a report, from the prison keeper. Remember, God gave Joseph favor with the prison keeper in chapter 39? And as a result, Joseph was given responsibility for overseeing all the prisoners. So the commander must have been informed by the prison keeper regarding Joseph's character and his trust in him. Again, making the most of his disappointing circumstance. And so Joseph was given the responsibility to serve them, to oversee their lives. He was responsible for their care. Verse 4 tells us, so they were in custody for a while. They were there for a period of time with Joseph. Now we know later in the narrative, chapter 40 and verse 20, that they will be reckoned with on Pharaoh's birthday. That's what he typically did on his birthday, reckoned with some of his prisoners. So that suggests to us that their offense occurred sometime between his previous birthday and his next birthday. So we're talking about, potentially up to 1 year And so in that context, they had some dreams. Verse 5 tells us, then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them. Each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. So they both had a dream the same night, each a different meaning. Verse 8, we'll see they didn't know the meaning and the meaning of that. And that's where Joseph enters the picture. Verse 6 tells us, and Joseph came in to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. And so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his Lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? So Joseph comes in, he sees the sadness on their face. He wants to know why. Now let's be real here and understand, Joseph was assigned to their care. So he had to show care. But it seems to me here that his concern for these two men was real, that it was genuine. And again, I point out to us this morning, Joseph had his own bad circumstances. He had his own difficulty. He had his own trials. He had his own disappointment. But yet we see him in that showing genuine concern for other people. That really stands out to me. How was he able to do that in such hard circumstances? I would suggest because of his relationship with God. Because it was deep. Because it was intimate. Because he was practicing the presence of God in his circumstances. And that allowed this young man, Joseph, to see everything through the eyes of God, including his disappointing circumstance. And that freed him to show care for other people, even though his own circumstances weren't what he wanted them to be. You know, I think we could learn something there. I think often as Christians, many Christians, I would say, are often not like Joseph when it comes to facing difficulty and disappointment. It's very natural for us when we face things that are hard and difficult and disappointing to only think of ourselves and what we're facing. And in fact, sometimes folks might even act like they have a right in their disappointment not to be concerned about someone else. In other words, I'm going through my stuff. This is hard, this is difficult, this is disappointing. And so God fully understands, that right now I have a right just to focus on me. I think we should let Joseph's example challenge us to be willing and be committed to showing concern for others in their circumstances, even though our circumstances aren't what we want them to be. Do we understand this morning? I hope we understand there's real benefit in doing that. When we have that kind of commitment, we won't be so defeated in what it is that we're facing. Now, that's not to lessen what we face. That's not to lessen the difficulty of it, but when we are able to show concern for other people, that will lessen the disappointment of our circumstances because our eyes will be taken off of ourselves, which is a really big problem. You see, there's a key to all of that, though. And I think this is what really framed Joseph's life. The key to being able to do that is our relationship with God, of course. But in that relationship, loving Him more than we love the smooth path. You see, that's a big part of the problem. We often love having the smooth path, everything being okay, more than we love God. And more that we're committed to loving Him, even though our circumstances aren't what we want them to be. See, this is part of Christ's life in us. This is really the expectation of God. The life that we live now, it's no longer our life. It's His life. It belongs to Him. And if He allows us to face hard and difficult and disappointing circumstances, He still expects us to allow His Son, Jesus Christ, to live His life through us, even in disappointment. And that will result in, I believe, showing concern for others. Yes, we'll hurt, it'll be difficult, but we'll be able to not just focus on ourselves, we'll also be able to give our attention to the needs and the concerns of others. And that will lessen the defeat and discouragement. Well, Joseph asked the question, "Why are you so sad?" Notice with me their response. And they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there's no interpreter of it." So they were sad. They had a dream, no one to interpret. You see, they knew this was something significant. They knew the dream was significant. And yet there was no one to help them understand the meaning. You see what they didn't realize? They were in the presence of the dreamer. You know, the one who had had his own experience with dreams that he knew that had come from God. Those dreams that he had shared with his brothers and his father. Those dreams that ultimately God would fulfill. In fact, the stage is being set for that to happen. Notice Joseph's quick response. Verse 8, he said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." There's a little rebuke there for these pagan men. They're from Egypt, so we can assume that they're pagan like everybody else in Egypt. And the science of interpreting dreams in ancient Egypt was a big part of the culture. In other words, people believed that dreams were a way to interpret the future. Chapter 41, we're going to see the Pharaoh call in his magicians and his astrologers to interpret his dreams to no avail. And that's where Joseph will come into the scene. He'll be called out of the prison to do that. So Joseph let them know interpretation of dreams belong to God. He is emphasizing to these two pagan men that the interpretation of dreams wasn't the business of the astrologers and the magicians. It was the business of God who gave them for His purposes. He's letting them know that his God was the only one who could relate the future. Joseph had great confidence in that. You know, again, he had his own experience with dreams. He knew those dreams came from God. He is still waiting for them to be fulfilled. And in fact, the stage is being set for that to happen. And so Joseph said, "Tell them to me, please." In other words, he's letting them know, I have a relationship with this one true God who is the interpreter of dreams. And in that statement, Joseph is relating to them his great confidence in his God. You see, Joseph knew at this moment God was at work. And he fully believed that God would give him the ability to interpret the dreams. You see, I like that. I mean, he's in prison. He's in a dungeon. He's a slave. I mean, his life is hard and difficult. And yet we see him not giving up on his God in his difficulty. We see him having great faith. We see him, even in this situation, continuing to desire to be used by God in interpreting the dreams. Our God wants to see Joseph and us when we're facing things that are hard, difficult, disappointing. He wants to see confident faith, great faith in who He is and His ability, not just in the good times, but also in the hard times, the difficult times, and the disappointing times. He also wants to see in our difficulty and in our disappointment a commitment to be used by Him. You know, not to sit on the sidelines just because we're going through something hard, but a commitment to be used by Him for His purposes in the lives of others. So let me ask you this morning, will you let Him see that in you? Will you let him, and I asked that question to me, will we let God see Joseph in us? With what it is that we may be facing that's hard and difficult and disappointing. And what I'm talking about, will we let him see confident faith? Will we let him see a commitment to be used? It's a good idea to let God see this because it will give us purpose, give us joy. It'll give us victory in what it is that may be hard and difficult and disappointing. We're learning a lot from Joseph. Let's continue to learn, shall we? The butler, he'll share his dream first. Verse 9 tells us, Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, Behold, in my dream a vine was set before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And then the Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. That's the dream, a summary. Now the interpretation by Joseph. Verse 12 tells us, And Joseph said to him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, that means to reckon with you, and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. So here's a summary of the interpretation. Joseph's interpretation of this dream related life. The butler was going to live. In 3 days, the butler would be restored to his role of being the king's butler. I mean, that's some pretty good news, right? Been in prison for a while, but the butler's being told that he's going to be restored to his position, that he's going to keep his life. So a very good interpretation of the dream for the butler, but Joseph had with that a request. This is really important. Notice with me verse 14 and 15. He said, But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house, the dungeon. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. So Joseph made his request to the butler. He knew the butler would be in a position that gave him the ear of the king. And remember the story of Nehemiah? He was the king's cupbearer. King Artaxerxes. He had the king's ear, and that resulted in Nehemiah receiving permission for some of the people of Israel to return from captivity to begin rebuilding the wall in Jerusalem. So that's what Joseph is hoping for here, that the butler would remember him, that the butler would show kindness to him. He is hoping that soon after the butler was restored to his position, that he would be released from that dungeon. Shared with that his past to give weight to his request. Verse 15. He was stolen away from his land. He was sold into slavery. He's letting this butler know, please let the king know I've done nothing. I've done nothing to warrant being put into this prison. So the butler has received his interpretation. The baker is now next. As verse 16 tells us, when the chief baker saw the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So the baker saw this, favorable interpretation for the butler. He was hoping for the same thing. See, the baker doesn't know it yet, but things aren't looking too good for him. It's never a good thing when you have birds eating something off the top of your head. And that's what's happening here. Something bad is probably going to happen, and it would. As Joseph responded, verse 18, he answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." So the interpretation here, in 3 days, the butler is going to be called to account, to be reckoned with by the king, but a far different result from the butler. He's going to be put to death. In fact, it was even somewhat graphic. The butler is going to become bird feed. The baker is probably thinking, "I wish I hadn't asked Joseph to interpret the dream." He's probably thinking, "I sure hope my dreams don't come true." But it would. Judgment day arrived, verse 20 tells us, "Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants." We're talking 3 days after their dream, now Pharaoh's birthday. Typical fashion, a big party for himself, all of his officials, his servants. He would usually issue judgment on his birthday of some of his prisoners. Some would be released, some would be executed. And so the butler and the baker were lifted out of prison to be reckoned with by Pharaoh. Let's see what happened. Verse 21 tells us, "Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And so the butler was restored. He's once again the king's cupbearer. It happened just like Joseph said. You see, this man, the butler, let's keep this in mind, he once again was in position to have Pharaoh's ear. Verse 22 tells us, "But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them." So again, just as Joseph said, now I've always felt kind of sorry for this baker. No? Maybe it's because I like bread so much. I think we can conclude this about the butler. I mean, I think we would assume the butler would be so relieved to live, to receive his position back, that he would have been thinking, "Man, this guy Joseph is really in touch with God. I can't wait to tell Pharaoh about this man Joseph, who related to me that all of this was going to happen while I was in prison." That's what you would think. But notice with me verse 23. "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." We're not told why. I mean, probably because it wasn't advantageous at the moment. Later it would be, and he would quickly recall. But he didn't tell Pharaoh about Joseph. I think you would agree with me this morning. This was another disappointment. This was another setback, from a human standpoint. I mean, Joseph had high hopes that he would soon be out of that dungeon. And yet we know that he would remain in that prison another 2 years. 2 years, that's a long time to be in a dungeon. So let's think about how Joseph could have responded. All of these disappointments that he has had in his life, his young life, and now another disappointment. He's left in this dungeon. Here's how he could have responded. He could have given up on God. He could have forgotten God. He could have forgotten continuing to grow his character before God and before man. He could have said, "I'm going to forget about being faithful to God. Look at what it's gotten me. I'm still in the dungeon." But here's the evidence. The evidence going forward will suggest that Joseph once again handled this disappointment well. Continued to serve God, continued to grow his character, continue to get ready. To get ready for the timing of God, when God would ultimately bring him out of that dungeon. You see, here's the thing. Joseph had his dreams. He knew those dreams had come from God. And he knew that God would be absolutely faithful to fulfill them in his time. And he would. We'll see that very soon. We talked a lot about the word disappointment this morning. Let's draw two conclusions, shall we? Just two thoughts of application in addition to what we've already shared to take with us regarding that subject. Opportunities that God is giving you and me when we face disappointment in life. Number one, when disappointment comes our way, God is giving us an opportunity to grow our character before Him. A writer by the name of Francis Roberts once stated, "Out of every disappointment there is treasure. Satan whispers all is lost. God says much can be gained." That was the mentality of Joseph. Another writer by the name of Theodore Parker once stated, "Disappointment is often the salt of life." And it is, or it can be, with a proper response. You see, God allows disappointment to come our way, not to crush us, but to grow us, and to mold us, and to shape us into His likeness, into the character of His Son, to grow us in spiritual maturity. Now, James made that clear in his classic text on trials in James chapter 1. So what is it that you're facing right now? Hard, difficult, maybe extremely disappointing. And it's not to downplay at all the disappointment that you're facing. The issue is, what are you going to do with it? Will you allow God to use that to grow you, keep you, mold you into the likeness of His Son, for the benefit of spiritual maturity and ultimately for His glory? Our second thought, our second conclusion this morning, when disappointment comes our way, God is giving us an opportunity to recognize that our sufficiency is in Him. I can't underscore this morning how important it is to recognize the importance of that statement. Not because I declared it, because it's reflective of the Scriptures. That our sufficiency is in God. You see, people disappoint. God doesn't. God allows disappointment to come our way, and sometimes we're disappointed by that. But God never disappoints in the sense that He allows something to come into our life for the purpose of hurting us. Everything that He allows to come into our lives is ultimately intended for our good, for our growth, for our maturity. Again, He works all things together for good to those who love Him, who are the called according to His purposes. He allows disappointment to come our way to teach us something really, really important. That our sufficiency is in Him. That He desires to be our everything. That our sufficiency can never be in people, our sufficiency can never be in circumstances, that our sufficiency is totally in Him. And you know, when we really begin to embrace that, that's when we really begin, or have opportunity to begin to take off in the Christian life. Are you facing something hard, difficult, disappointing? Look up to Him. Look up to Him right now. Invite Him to be your everything. You know, as Paul put it in Colossians chapter 3, invite Him to be your all in all. That's what He wants. He wants to be your everything, your sufficiency. Look up to Him. And in that hard and difficult and disappointing circumstance, let Him give you His peace. Let Him give you His victory. See, He can do that even in the dungeon of our discipline. Pray with me. Father, we thank you so much this morning for your word that you have given on this account, an example of the life of Joseph. This great young man who was great because he had a great God and a great relationship with Him. And so thank you for recording all of this for us in your inspired and inerrant word, intended for us not just to admire, but to challenge us, change us, to grow us. And so, Father, I pray that you use your word in that way in my own life, in the life of every person in this church family, in the life of every person who was heard this morning here in this building, or if they're listening online. That, Father, if we are a believer, we will realize that in our hard and difficult circumstances, you are at work to grow us for your glory, for your honor, and for our benefit. And also for our impact on the lives of people. So thank you, Father. Thank you for your goodness to us this morning and giving us this word, reminding us of your faithfulness and reminding us that you alone are our sufficiency. I pray, Father, this morning that we will truly, truly embrace that and enjoy the victory that is ours in the Lord Jesus Christ, in spite of our circumstances. And this I pray in